hosting a podcast discussion from the Macro Musings podcast series by David Beckworth. Shout out to David Beckworth, really useful series. So he had Brian Sack on, and Brian Sack is a former Fed official, and he was actually in charge of the markets operations during, I think, QE1. He was involved with QE2. He's doing a lot of work on all these issues that I think are center point in my argument and many people's argument that this is kind of the, if you want, the red pill moment for economists, the red pill moment for hedge fund managers, anybody who believes in economics as a science and thinks that human behavior and economics are tightly knit together. Went through that period of time, which I'm talking about sort of the post-2008 crisis and Bernanke and all of that, and had to realize that this is really the beginning of the end of our system as we know, what we call liberal democracy or maybe capitalism or whatever name you want to use for this particular system where people exchange voluntarily in a sort of what we call free market way, that there's some oversight, that there's government, that there's law, there's branches of government, and people are free to choose what they want to do, how they want to operate within the context of the law, within the context of norms, and so on and so forth. So that type of system, according to my view and according to many other people's view, is in jeopardy because of bureaucrats like Brian Sack and the Fed and in general Congress and the US government system and also other liberal democracies around the world are really in decline because we are neglecting the human aspect of free money. We're neglecting the human aspect of having a central bank that controls money. And I'm going to discuss what I mean. Now, let me now be clear. This particular episode, so my episode, is a reaction to Brian Sack and his comments on the David Beckworth podcast, right? And what Brian Sack is doing is kind of defending his position, saying QE worked. I think we did a good job. I think people are criticizing the Fed for the wrong reasons. And to some extent, he's right, but I want to criticize his comments, particularly.
I'm criticizing his statement that QE worked.
Because I don't think it worked, and I'm going to explain why. Second, I want to second his argument that, yes, if you have critiques around the misuse of the Fed, so if you're not happy with the way the Fed could be used, well, then you have to attack the place where it's being misused, and that is Congress, and that is the White House, and not the Fed itself. Now, I disagree with that in the sense that you still have a responsibility as a Fed official to take that into account. You can't just blindly be a technocrat and do what works. And I think third, most importantly, like every other bureaucrat, every other official in Washington, these people, they have careers, they have reputations, and they also want to succeed in what they do, and therefore they're relatively short-term oriented, and that's why all this comments and all this, I would say, unhappy coincidence between Fed officials doing their thing and bureaucrats elsewhere and politicians using them. That's why this is even possible. This is not even on podcast. It's May 2nd. 2023, this is Krim Delco. Since the last update, the fund's roughly flat. The market is down 80 basis points. For the year, we are up 32.8%. The market is up 8%. We're outperforming by 24%. Let's talk about the actual podcast first. So Brian Sack, he's a former Fed official. He worked under Bernanke's QE1 program in 2008, and he was there, and then he left and he worked for D.E. Shaw, and so on and so forth. He says that QE worked. So quantitative easing was implemented in 2008 because the financial markets were in massive crisis, and the traditional policy of the Fed until that point has been to just manipulate short-term interest rate. And the idea was that you have somebody who manipulates very short-term interest rates, and then from there, due to interest rate theory and other aspects of finance and economics, you have sort of a proliferation of actions throughout the market. And the market decides, let's say, what long-term interest rates should be. The market decides what equity markets should be like. The market decides how mortgages should be priced. It all starts with short-term interest rates. And this really starts, if you just look at one formula in finance, and I don't want to get too technical, but just one formula, and that is the formula of a futures, meaning what is the worth of something in the future? Well, it's worth whatever it's worth today in the present, and then discounted somehow with interest rates, and that interest rate is sort of the risk-free rate, or the rate that is used to discount that is somehow related to the Fed funds rate. So this is sort of the idea, the fundamental idea behind how the Fed used to do policy before QE was introduced. When QE was introduced, we were in the midst of a massive financial crisis. And the 2008 crisis was massive in many ways, and the Fed decided to buy bonds. So that was QE, quantitative easing. So you actively buy bonds. Now, this is already my first caveat here, which is that Brian Sachs said, well, QE worked. Well, it might have worked in the short term, but if you really think about what the Fed did back then, it circumvented Congress in a way that it said, look, we can't go to the lawmakers and discuss the pros and cons of us interfering in the market and buying securities directly from the banking system in order to save the banks. We can't. Like, there was this conversation about TARP, which was implemented. It was I think, $750 billion rescue package, which was supposed to buy securities and help the banks survive. And QE was kind of, in a nutshell, saying, well, we're not even going to wait for Congress to approve that. We're just going to do it ourselves in the name of the mandate that we have as a Federal Reserve, which is to stabilize the economy. This is what quantitative easing was. The Fed buying mortgage-backed securities directly from the banks, and therefore stabilizing the price, but much, much more importantly, stabilizing the balance sheet of the banks and stabilizing the banks themselves. By the way, similarly, today the bureaucrats are intervening in banks, as the Silicon Valley Bank and so on and so forth. They're not saving the banks in terms of shareholders and all that, but they're saving the system from contagion. And what Brian Sachs is saying is, well, this worked. Now we're back in 2008. QE worked. And my criticism here is the following. First, define worked. What does that actually mean? In the short term, you prevented a further deterioration of financial conditions. Yes, that's true. In the short term, you saved banks. That's true. But you created two massive long-term consequences. Number one, you kept banks alive that should have been restructured. And number two, you opened up a Pandora's box because you told the markets that in the future, bad management, bad banking regulation, bad anything that has to do with finance will just simply be bailed out by the Federal Reserve, which controls money and therefore has access to the most important resource, which is money, which in other words is resource. So access to resources that can mitigate any kind of negative effect that a policy has.
Most striking example of how QE went bad is that today we have QE4, and there the Fed is not just buying bonds from banks, it's buying bonds from the government, and it's financing the government. And this is the ultimate proof that QE didn't work, because it did exactly what economists predicted. It created a moral hazard. It turned Congress into a money-wasting machine. We have over 30 trillion in debt only because that the Fed is just buying all the bonds. And this is, to me, it's irresponsible from somebody like Brian Sack to even talk about the QE as a positive thing when you have this fact to deal with, when you have this particular fact to recognize a massive failure in government supervision, a massive failure in the fabric of our society that you caused by deciding to buy the bonds and by starting QE. I think it's like we said many times, it's the beginning of the end of liberal democracy. And I think people like Brian Sack, instead of trying to tap on their shoulders and trying to protect their reputation, they should acknowledge it. People that acknowledge mistakes are the first to lead us towards some improvement. And unfortunately, Brian Sack is not one of them. And I think, just lastly on this argument, I just want to say that there's a lot of literature written on how people cannot admit big mistakes. When mistakes are too big, they just can't admit them. They're too big. And I think that's wrong. I mean, there's nothing wrong with somebody like Brian Sack going out and saying, look, we've done this. We did it because of X, Y, and Z. And now we believe it's wrong and we need to fix certain things. There's nothing wrong with that. And I think it would be very helpful for bureaucrats, maybe not him. He doesn't seem to have that kind of spine, but others to come out. Maybe Ben Bernanke could do it. He got the Nobel Prize. Why doesn't he come out and say, look, I made a mistake. This is way out of control now. We have too much debt and we need to fix the system. But again, it's not happening. But I think David Beckworth on this front is really doing a great job, because he's at least bringing these people out so we can hear what they
stupid policies with basically took away the constraint that economics puts on on policy. For example, COVID would never have happened. I mean, the reaction to COVID would never have happened in a system where we don't have fiat money, because nobody would have wasted $5 trillion on a hypothetical lockdown and whatever else we did, and constrain people to the extent that people were constrained, if they had to pay out of their own purse. The health industrial complex of the United States and around the world would never have agreed to such a policy if they had to pay out of their own purse. But because it's fiat money, they didn't care, and that's why we had this massive increase in the Fed balance sheet, and so on and so forth. There is a very simple data point which proves my point, which is QE1 was maybe, I think, whatever, 1 or 2 trillion, something along those lines. QE4, which was what we did during COVID, was $5 trillion. So you can see how this moral hazard is already proliferating through the system, and it's exponentially, or not exactly exponential, but it's growing faster than linearly, and that's also normal, because the analogy is always the drug addict, right? I used to do a little, and a little won't do, so I started doing more and more. This is a Guns N' Roses line, Mr. Brownstone, the song, and this is exactly what applies to the Fed. You start with a little, and then a little won't do, and you have to do more and more and more. And this is where we are right now. Now, Jay Powell is reducing that to his credit, and that's a good thing. And there are good people in the Fed certainly understanding what's going on, but they're doing it as a reaction to the inflation which has kicked in as a consequence of COVID. So we have, of course, certain checks and balances within the economic system, which fortunately work and even constrain the Fed. But I think somebody like Brian Sack, instead of walking around tapping on his own shoulder, he should acknowledge these things. I think that shows how unprofessional he is, and that's my criticism. It's unprofessional. He worked for the Fed, then he went to D. Shaw. He collected his paycheck from the private sector, which is another typical, I would say, dynamic, and I think not very good, that we have this situation where public officials can do bad things on the public side and then go to the private sector and even collect their more money. We have to have a little bit more checks and balances when it comes to these public officials, when they make mistakes of the magnitude that were made during those QE times, and they're still being made at the Federal Reserve. I think people need to be accountable for those mistakes. It's this argument. The problem with the Federal Reserve, for people who are not familiar with concepts like moral hazard, it's a bit like saying, look, I feel bad today, let me take a little bit of Coke, and that's going to make me feel good. And I think that little bit of coke will make you feel good in the short term. It will. And then you can go and say, well, you see, it worked. I mean, what's the problem? Well, the problem is that you're destroying your health, and you're creating this precedent where next time you're going to use coke again when you feel bad, and it's not going to be enough. You're going to have to use more and more and more, and it's exponentially more, and then you're going to end up as a drug addict in rehab and all of that stuff. This is the analogy, and it's exactly working. I mean, it's working exactly the way, let's say, we economists predict it should work, and that's why I think Brian Sack is not genuine. He's a disingenuous bureaucrat who is trying to protect his legacy and his status and all of that. And to me, that is unacceptable. And I think David Beckwith should do a better job in criticizing these people. But I understand where he's coming from. His podcast lives off these people. If he starts criticizing them, then they won't come on his podcast. So he's doing it actually in a very good way. He's very passive. He lets them talk and then lets us listeners make the decision. So I'm happy with David Beckwith. And it's actually, I'm going to retract that. He shouldn't be being more aggressive because then they wouldn't go there and then we wouldn't even hear. I think it's very valuable to hear these comments. And therefore, anyway, shout out to David Beckwith. And this would be my criticism to Brian Sack. The second point I want to make is Brian Sack's point, and there I am in agreement with him, which is, look, if you say, listen, Brian, what you did is wrong because you neglected the long-term consequences that this will have on the banking sector and the politicians. Well, and then you tell me, well, fine, but listen, you can't attack me if you're telling me that my actions influence other people in a negative way. Then you should go attack them, or meaning you go to Congress and fix Congress so they can't misuse, let's say, the Federal Reserve for their political purposes. Or you go and fix the banking sector. If you know there's moral hazard in the system, well, you can still have regulations to the point where that moral hazard doesn't necessarily, destroy the banking sector and so on and so forth. So what he's saying is true. I agree with that. The Federal Reserve as an institution cannot be accountable for everything that happens in the economy. That's true. I agree with that. However, you can't pretend that your actions don't have long-term consequences. So this is a little bit like saying, well, the drug dealer is not it's not his fault if the husband buys the drugs and then beats his wife, right? That's something that is sort of a secondary or tertiary effect. Yeah, kind of true, but still, he's the drug dealer, and he's the fundamental cause why the husband was not conscious when he was doing all these crazy things. So I think I do agree with that. I mean, we have to fix a lot more than just the Fed, but the Fed is unfortunately this Trojan horse that is undermining liberal democracy, and I think you see it really, really well in Europe. Because the EU as a system, I think, has a lot of merit. And I'm very much for many things that the EU has, particularly given the history of Europe. But the European Central Bank is a Trojan horse to completely destroy the economic fabric of Europe. And that's something that I'm sure most European bureaucrats don't see or don't want to see. Because what they do on a daily basis is not undermining Europe. That's not what they do. But if you have a system where Italy and Portugal and Spain and so on and so forth can just freely borrow money using the credit of Germany, you will destroy these economies, and it's not going to work. And a system in Japan, different dynamics, different nationalistic movements, and all of that, but still very similar dynamics there. So I think again, I am somewhat sympathetic with the argument that the Federal Reserve as an institution has certain mandates, and it cannot be held accountable for other institutions such as Congress misusing the Fed. That is something that needs to be addressed in Congress. That I agree with, but the Fed as a policy-making institution still has to take into account those effects. Again, we can't pretend that economics doesn't exist. And I think my third point that I want to make here is supporting my argument that we are in the tail end of liberal democracy because of fiat money, because of bureaucrats that have different incentives than we would hope for. And what I mean with that is the following. Like, Brian Sack is a very good example. He's a career bureaucrat who worked in public and then went private, made money. I'm sure he made a lot of money. And he made it, I would say, a little bit on the back of the public sector. And that's something that I think political economy and people, let's say our founding fathers, Montesquieu, whoever designed Voltaire and the Enlightenment people, and even people today that talk about sort of more the constitutional side of our system, that people that think about how we should organize ourselves as a society, they forget that the bureaucrats, that the people like Brian Sack have self-interest like everybody else. And that self-interest can lead towards negative effects if you give them as much power as we're giving the Federal Reserve. In other words, we have to rein in on, we cannot give institutions this much power exactly because people like Brian Sack exist. Okay, we can have a theoretical discussion about the Federal Reserve and what it should do and what it should not do, but we should always assume that there is very, very narrow-minded people who have their own self-interest first and foremost at the forefront of what they do, and they will do everything it takes to protect their status, to protect their careers. They will not have sort of a public servant, I don't know, ideological view of things and maybe do things that harm them personally but help society. They won't do any of that stuff. I think this has to be the initial condition by which we start when we think about how to design systems. This all mean, I think my third point is sort of an initial thought, inspiration, hopefully, for people to rethink our system. In particular, rein in the powers of the Fed. The Fed has way too much power, and it doesn't work because exactly people like Brian Sack are there. And even if they go there with good intentions, they will turn into little monsters because you give them access to this monster. You know, if you stare the monster too deep into the face or something like that, then the monster will stare back at you. If you work for a monster, with a monster, you will become the monster. I don't care how ideological you are. In the case of Brian Sack, it looks like he doesn't really care. He's just a career bureaucrat. He made his money, he made his reputation, he's happy. But other people maybe go there and they do care, but they can't even help it. It's too big. So my conclusion here is that, again, this is a reaction podcast, so I'm reacting to what Brian Sack said on the Macro Musings podcast, and my 3 points are: number one, you can't pretend economics doesn't exist. QE didn't work because of the long-term effects of moral hazard in particular, and it created zombie banks and a Congress that is, basically thinks money is free, which created a massive, massive debt, and those are facts, and you can't just go around and pretend these things don't exist. Number two, I agree with you that we have to fix Congress, we have to fix the banking system. We can't blame the Fed for all of this. I agree with that, but still, back to my point one, when you do policy, you have to take those things into account, and you can't pretend they don't exist. And number three, I think we need to absolutely assume that bureaucrats, particularly in the Fed, but everywhere else, are the power-seeking, wealth-seeking maximizers like everywhere else. You know, the economic system theoretically assumes that humans are profit maximizers. They do what's good for them, and they follow incentives and blah, blah, blah. And that's all true. But we can't pretend that public officials are not like that. And we saw that during COVID. We saw that during QE in 2008 financial crisis. Bureaucrats take matters in their own hands. And often that leads to bad results. So I think, again, I am a shout out to David Beckworth. I'm very happy that he has this podcast. I don't agree with most of the Fed officials that go on that podcast. And he has a very good and passive way to get them there and let them talk, and then they speak for themselves. And this is very powerful. So shout out to David Beckworth. Yes, my final point is that, look, we have Bitcoin, of course. Bitcoin is supposed to be the counterbalance to this. And this is already the answer to my last question, which is, okay, what can we do about this, right? What can we do about this? The best we can do about this is create competition. And this is what, Satoshi Nakamoto did. He created this Bitcoin cryptocurrency, which was supposed to counterbalance this freewheeling bureaucratic answer that the Federal Reserve started to become after QE1 was launched. I think Nakamoto did the right thing. This is definitely one way we will fix the system. But of course, we also have the ability to actually sit down and fix the existing system. And I think Bitcoin helps there. But I think as adults, we can still sit down and have a fundamental conversation about how we can fix these things. And this would be my takeaway, my biggest takeaway from this. We have to take people like Brian Sachs seriously. These are bureaucrats. They might have good intentions, but they turn out to be very, very dangerous for the system with their actions. And we have to take that into account and fix the system. Thank you.